Dear listeners, today we will be talking on the caste system in India. What is the caste system? All of us at different points of time in our life have come across caste without realizing that it is the caste system that we are dealing with. All of us have different surnames, all of us have a different occupation, and all of us interact with one another differently. We often wonder that why is it that we have a different surname? The surname often indicates our caste. But many of us are not familiar with this anymore. And the reason why we are not familiar with this anymore today is because caste has undergone a transformation over a period of time. I am sure you must have also heard of the terms SC, STs and OBCs. These are also terms which actually originate from the caste system. And in the course of our discussion today, we will be talking on all of these. The caste system in India is actually a system of social stratification which has a pre-modern origin. And the way that we know the caste system today was actually because of the Britishers. The Britishers in 1901 for the first time conducted a census in the Indian population, and that census was a caste based census. And broadly, if we were to talk of the caste system is a process by which we place people in different occupational groups. The caste system is something which has pervaded several aspects of the Indian society, and it has existed for centuries. And often the argument given is that it is rooted in religion and it is based on a division of labor. What are the characteristics of a caste system? The caste system consists of segmentation of society into groups, hierarchy, restrictions on food, drinking and smoking, endogamy, and the concept of purity and pollution. What is meant by the segmentation of society? When we talk of the segmentation of society, please think of an earthworm which has segments. That means just as the earthworm is divided into different parts, similarly we too in society have different caste groups. We have different systems of social stratification. We have various varnas, we have various jatis, and each of the varnas, each of the castes and each of the jatis has their own lifestyles. In the caste system, ascription is the major criteria. That means your caste is determined by birth and you cannot change it throughout your life. Plus, the caste to which you belong is something which you inherit. That means it is given to you by birth. Hierarchy. The term hierarchy has to do with the ranking of castes according to the concept of purity and pollution. A hierarchical system is one where the Brahmins occupy the highest position. But this hierarchy was disputed in some cases, and in various linguistic areas, hundreds of castes had a gradation generally acknowledged by everybody. Below the Brahmins, you had the Kshatriyas, then you had the Vaishyas, and then finally you had the Shudras. The second characteristics of caste that we can talk about has to do with restrictions on food, drinking and smoking, or in short we can also call this commensal relationships. Different caste groups could not interact with one another randomly. There were strict rules which each of the caste groups had to follow in terms of food and drink. And generally what happened was, it was only the pakka food which was accepted by the higher castes from the lower castes and not the kacha food. Now, pakka food was something, it does not mean the raw and the cooked, but pakka food was something which was cooked in ghee and kacha food was something which was cooked in water. So, foodstuffs like khichdi or dal which was cooked in water was something which you could not offer to the higher castes, whereas foodstuffs which had been fried in ghee was considered to be pure. Endogamy. Endogamy has to do with marriage practices, and the term endogamy means that a person can only marry somebody within the same caste group. So, that means there were very strict rules governing intercaste marriages as well, and people could only marry within the same caste, but different subcastes. That means as far as marriage relationships were concerned, people from different regions belonging to the same caste but different subcastes could marry one another. I am sure you have often heard of honor killings. When you talk of honor killings typically take place when people tend to break the intercaste marriage rule. That is, when people do not practice endogamy, but they practice exogamy. The term exogamy means marrying outside your caste group. The concept of purity and pollution, that is something which we have already discussed in terms of food, but the concept of purity and pollution is also in terms of occupation, it is also in terms of the way that you interact with one another. So, some occupations were considered to be pure, like those followed by the Brahmins, the Vaishyas and the Kshatriyas, and some occupations which were followed by the Harijans or the Shudras, as we called them earlier, they were considered to be impure occupations. Impure occupations were occupations like scavenging. They included occupations of leather workers, that is the chamars. It also included all unclean tasks. Occupations. Now, if one was to look at occupations within the caste system, occupations were generally inherited and you could not choose which occupation you wanted to follow. So, that means if your father belonged to the Brahman caste and he was a priest, then you too had to be a Brahman, you too had to follow the profession of your father. If your father was a Kshatriya, that means if he was a warrior, you too had to be a warrior. If your father was a merchant, that is a Vaishya, then you too had to be a Vaishya. And if you were a Shudra and you were engaged in agricultural labor or you were engaged in, let us say, working with leather, then that is what you were supposed to do. These were very strict rules of castes which were applicable earlier, but as we proceed further, we will realize that these things have undergone change. And whatever I am discussing with you right now, dear listeners, please do understand that this is a very typical book view of the caste system, and it is not necessary that we do find it in our day-to-day interactions. Now, in terms of social and religious disabilities and privileges, lower castes had to follow a lot of restrictions, like for instance, they were not allowed to enter temples, they were not allowed to wear gold ornaments, they were not allowed to use umbrellas. And in some places, and by the way, the caste system is not something which is restricted merely to India, you also find it in other South Asian countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and the restrictions placed on the lower castes are again universally to be found in all of these South Asian countries. For example, in Sri Lanka, it was an accepted practice that the lower castes, that is the unclean castes, had to carry a branch, and the purpose of the branch was that they were supposed to wipe off their footsteps, because even their footsteps were considered to be unclean. So, if they were dragging a branch behind them, that means they were automatically wiping off their footsteps, so that a pure caste, a Brahman, would not accidentally step on their footsteps. In other places, there were funny practices like the scheduled castes or the lower castes either ringing a bell or blowing a whistle, telling everybody that they were on their way, because they were considered to be completely defiling, to the extent that even their shadows were considered to be defiling. And of course, no such restrictions were placed on the Brahmins, no such restrictions were placed on the Kshatriyas and also on the Vaishyas. Now, in terms of speech, each of the caste group had its own customs, its own dress patterns and its own speech. So, that means you could easily make out you could easily make out a person belonged to which caste group. So, for example, the way that you wore your sari, different caste groups wore the saris in a different way. The way that you wore your dhoti, each of the caste groups will be wearing a dhoti in a different way. And like I had just mentioned a little bit earlier, that the lower castes were not allowed to wear ornaments. So, that means again, if you were wearing ornaments, you did not belong to the lower caste, but you belong to the higher caste groups. Now, as far as the discussion that we've had so far, this discussion has been we've broadly been talking about the 4 Varanas. Now, the term Varana actually also means color, but of course, one cannot distinguish between different caste groups based on color or Varana, because if we were to just look at one another, all of us roughly have the same skin tone. So, literally the term Varana means color, but in practice what one finds is that Varana is not really the operative term, or it is not really the operative. In practice what we find is that the Varna is not really the operative term for caste, instead it is jatis which become the operative unit. Now, what is the difference between a jati and a Varna? Varna, as I have just told you, Varna has to do with color, it has to do with the 4 Varnas which I have already mentioned to you, like the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas and the Shudras in that order in terms of their hierarchy. Now, jatis are not 4, but jatis are innumerable. Roughly there are around 4,000 odd jatis, and the jatis are also referred to as the subcastes, and the jatis have to do with complex social groups that are not universally applicable, because jatis again tend to vary from region to region. The sociologist Andre Bete notes that the Varna played a major role in caste in classical Hindu literature, but it is jati which is the operative unit. The term Varna represents a closed collection of social orders, whereas jati is entirely open ended, and you can go on adding new jatis depending on which sect, which denomination, which linguistic minority or which nationality you belong to. The relationships between different caste groups is based on a Jajmani system. The term Jajmani actually has to do with a patron-client relationship. I am sure you have heard the term patron and client in terms of market-based relationships, in terms of service-based relationships. Similarly, in the caste system, what you had was that the relationship that people had with one another was a patron-client relationship in which the different jatis, the different caste groups performed various services for one another. So, say for example, if you belonged to one of the jatis, that is one of the subcastes of the Brahman Varna, then you would be performing the function of either teaching or performing a religious ritual, in return for which, if you belonged to the Vaishya caste or one of the subcastes or one of the jatis of the Vaishyas, then, and if you were a merchant, then in return for the services given to you by the Brahmins, you would be giving them, let us say for example, so a certain amount of grain or maybe cloth, or if you belonged to the Shudra caste, then you could be performing some kind of manual labor for the upper castes, let us say for example, cleaning out the cow sheds, or perhaps sweeping the veranda or cleaning the utensils in the Jajman's household, right. So, that means when you talk about the Jajmani relationship, you are talking about the relationship between the Jajman, that is the patron, and the Kameen, that is the client. So, you have a relationship of a patron and a client relationship, and this relationship was something which was not just restricted to one generation, but it continued over a period of time. And even if many of you may be living in villages, and what you will realize today is that in villages today also such kind of relationships do exist. The only difference that has now happened is that because money has now entered transactions, often in addition to giving people goods and goods like let us say cloth or grain, you also give them a certain amount of money. So, if you belong to the lower caste, so typically what you would find is that a lower caste person in a higher caste person's household would perhaps be cleaning out the cow shed, in return for which they would get perhaps a meal or two to eat, some amount of money, some amount of grain once a month maybe, and certain special gifts on certain festive occasions. So, that means this meant that you had a society in which there was a relationship which had been continuing over generations. But this is now beginning to undergo a change. Why is it undergoing a change? The reason why it is now beginning to undergo a change is because of also the introduction of the class system. Now, when you talk about the class system, class does not have to do with caste. Instead, the term class has to do with occupational choices. Also, the term class also has to do with your economic choices. So, that means when you belong to a particular class, let us say for example, you could be a middle class person, but you could be belonging to the lower caste. So, that means what now happens is that your caste status to a certain extent gets diluted because of your class status, right. So, that means caste and class help us to have a certain kind of mobility in the caste system. Now, so that means what we are saying today is that there have been changes in the caste system. Now, why is it that classes have become the operative unit today? One of the reasons why class has become one of the factors bringing about change in the caste system is because there are various processes of change which are underway. Now, the various processes of change which are underway are broadly westernization, modernization, industrialization, urbanization and Sanskritization. Now, let us look at them one by one. When you talk about westernization, then you are actually talking about a system in which people tend to adopt a Western style of living, a Western style of dressing, and also your outlook changes. You develop a rational and a scientific outlook. You believe in material progress. You start communicating using mass media. You may also have an English medium education. So that means what you are therefore saying is that Westernization means that now you are no longer able to identify one another on the basis of caste, on the basis of dress, on the basis of speech. If you remember earlier, we had said that speech, dress and language were often associated with a particular caste group, but because of Westernization, this has undergone a change. What are the conditions for Sanskritization? The conditions for Sanskritization are: it should be a touchable status, you need to have a better economic status, and typically in order to sustain your claim to Sanskritization, you should be able to justify it on the basis of some myth or story. So, say for example, one of the stories could be that you were running away from some king, and because of which you were forced to hide in the forest for several years. If you were hiding in the forest for several years, in order to sustain yourself, you started working with leather, because of which you became leather workers, or you became people who work with chamra. But in reality, your status is much higher. So that means now you are able to justify your claim to a higher status based on some story or myth, right? Now, apart from Sanskritization and Westernization, change in the concept of the caste system has also come about because of modernization. Now, what does the term modernization mean? The term modernization means that your outlook becomes more rational. It also means that the society as a whole permits greater amount of social mobility. It also means social mobility that is permitted in your society is because of a democratic setup. So that means you are following the principles of democracy, that are liberty, equality and fraternity. And it is not necessary that the term modernization has to be the same as Westernization. Modernization may include Westernization, but you can also modernize without Westernizing. That means you could continue to dress in your traditional way, you could continue to behave as you traditionally did in terms of the kind of food that you eat, but you become modern in your outlook. Other changes that have come about in the caste system are also because of economic and political factors. Because of economic and political factors, what has now happened is that certain castes in some regions have become the dominant caste. Now, the term dominant caste means that they have started dominating over the other caste groups. Now, why has this happened? This has happened because generally what might have happened is that you may have access to larger land holdings. You may belong to a lower caste, but because of, let's say, because of Chakbandi, that is because of land consolidation, you have access to larger land holdings. You may also belong to a politically dominant caste. That means people of your caste group also belong to the ruling parties. What might also happen is that you may also have a higher ritual status. You may also have a larger population. So, because of which what happens is that you become the dominant caste. Other changes that have happened are also because of industrialization and urbanization. Now, the factors of industrialization and urbanization have led to the growth of towns and cities, and the growth of towns and cities has now meant that people have started following new kinds of occupations. It has also meant that class becomes the operative term. Now, because you are living in towns and cities, you have migrated from other areas, people sitting next to you, people in your office, people in your classrooms may not know to which caste you belong. The only indication that they may have to your caste is perhaps through your surname, and many of us do not even write a surname anymore. So that means it's very difficult to identify to which caste you belong. And why has this happened? This has happened because of industrialization and urbanization. See, the process of industrialization is one in which agriculture is now no longer the dominant mode of production. Instead, what happens is you start working in factories. If you're working in factories, that means you are standing next to a person, working next to a person throughout the day without really bothering about his or her caste system, right? So that means in cities, it is not possible to follow the caste rules to such an extent as you may perhaps have followed them in the earlier times, right? So that has also greatly diluted the caste system. Now, the government of India very consciously has been trying to do away with the caste system, because as you very well know, there are lots of evils that are associated with the caste system. You've heard of caste based violence, I am sure. You've also heard of the lower caste children not being allowed to sit in classrooms, instead being made to clean out toilets in schools. Right now, all of this is illegal. Now, why has this become illegal? All of this has become illegal. The government of India, through its legal process, has introduced various legislations through which untouchability has now become a crime. If untouchability has become a crime, what does this mean? This simply means that you cannot discriminate between people on the basis of their caste. You cannot force people to sit outside classrooms. You cannot force children in schools just because they belong to the lower caste groups to go and clean toilets. All of this makes it illegal. Plus, what the government has also did is there's something called this process of positive affirmation. Now, if you're talking about the process of positive affirmation, that means the government of India has also introduced a system of reservation. Through reservation, very often what you will find is that many of the posts, like let's say for example, the post of the Sarpanch is now reserved for the scheduled castes. And you see, the term scheduled caste also means that you are now no longer calling them untouchables. And I am sure you are also familiar with Gandhi's word Harijan, Harijan meaning people of God. That was also his attempt to mitigate or dilute the impact of the caste system. Now, as I was saying, the government of India has reserved certain posts in the panchayat, including the post of the Sarpanch, for the scheduled caste. That means the higher castes who traditionally ruled the society can now no longer aspire to become a Sarpanch, can no longer aspire for a position in the village panchayat. It is only the scheduled castes who can become the panchayat members. So, that means caste and class go hand in hand. You know, the other day when I was in a village, what was very interesting for me was I went to the Sarpanch's house, and the Sarpanch belonged to a lower caste, but he had a very high position in the village because he was the Sarpanch meaning the head of the panchayat. And what was further very interesting was that this Sarpanch also was a very rich grain merchant, who dealt with grains, who dealt with buying and selling of grains in the neighboring city. So, you see, what have I said? Through this example, I have shown you that it is caste, it is class, and it is also the system of positive affirmation by the government of India, which has now led to the dilution of the caste system, or the caste system has become modernized, right? And I am sure you have also heard of the term OBCs. The term OBC actually deals with other backward classes. That is also a collective term given by the government of India, in which those caste groups which were classically, that means from the earlier times, socially and educationally disadvantaged, were given certain advantages. That means, and this happened because of the Mandal Commission in the 1980s. And I am sure you have heard of OBC reservations, I am sure you have heard of SC reservations, you have also heard of ST reservations. These are all attempts by the government to mitigate the evil effects of the caste system. And today what has happened is that we are interacting with one another, we are talking to one another irrespective of our caste system. So, that means the caste system has undergone a system of change, and today caste is now no longer a criteria which limits your achievement in society. Listeners, let us sum up what is it that we have learned today. Today we began actually by talking about what is the book view of the caste system in terms of the various varnas. Then we went on to discuss that it is not the book view, not the varna system, rather it is the jati system which is the operative unit for caste, for interaction amongst caste groups. Jati is in terms of the jajmani relationships the different caste groups have with one another. Then we spoke about what are the various factors like modernization, Sanskritization and westernization, industrialization, urbanization, which have led to changes in the caste system. And in the end, we also spoke about the emerging picture of caste today. And today the caste system has been greatly impacted by the various legislations, the various positive steps taken by the government of India in terms of reservations in the panchayat system, reservations in various educational institutions, reservations in jobs in the government sector for people who belonged to the scheduled castes, that is the SCs, And not just the SCs, we also towards the end we also brought in OBCs, because I am sure you often come across the term OBCs. The term OBC means other backward classes, and this includes those caste groups which have been disadvantaged. And I am sure you have also heard of the term creamy layer. The term creamy layer means those caste groups which are economically well off, so they cannot claim advantages under the OBC reservation system. So that means today we have a society which is an egalitarian society, or at least we are gradually progressing towards an egalitarian society in which discrimination based on caste has become illegal. Thank you.
हिंदुस्तान के हर कोने में नौजवानों के पास प्रतिभा है, उन्हें अवसर चाहिए।
NIOS देता रहा है युवाओं को अवसर आगे बढ़ने का। NIOS से पढ़ने वाले इन युवाओं ने किया है संस्थान को गौरवान्वित। दिव्यांगों ने बन के दिखाया है सबल और आत्मनिर्भर। NIOS के साथ आप भी जुड़िए NIOS के संग।
प्रकाशित करने राहों को आलोकित करने, हम अपना दीपक स्वयं बने, हम अपना रास्ता स्वयं चुने। हम अपना दीपक स्वयं बने, हम अपना रास्ता स्वयं चुने। जीवन ये प्रकाशित करने राहों को आलोकित करने।
धन साधन समय की सीमा से विद्यालय जो मुक्त हो, धन साधन समय की सीमा से विद्यालय जो मुक्त हो।
कभी पढ़े हम कहीं पढ़े वे विषय की लोच से युक्त हो,
कभी पढ़े हम कहीं पढ़े वे विषय की लोच से युक्त हो।
मित्रों हम उठे और जागे,
मंजिल आने की ध्वनि सुने। हम अपना दीपक स्वयं बने, हम अपना रास्ता स्वयं चुने।
जीवन ये प्रकाशित करने राहों को आलोकित करने।
राष्ट्रीय मुक्त विद्यालय का है द्वार खुला सबकी खातिर। शिक्षा परीक्षा का अवसर एक बार ही क्यों मिलता फिर।
शिक्षा और परीक्षा का अवसर एक बार ही क्यों मिलता फिर। दुनिया में इसके केंद्र